My name is Jay Joseph. I am a licensed psychologist in California. And one of my sideline areas of interest is the genetics of mental disorders. And I've been studying that since the late 90s. I did my doctoral dissertation on the genetics of schizophrenia, and I've continued on that theme. I've written 4 books on kind of critiquing genetic theories in psychology and psychiatry. And I did do a book on the genetics of schizophrenia, kind of a critical overview in an ebook form called Schizophrenia and Genetics, The End of an Illusion. And this is just a very big area of interest that I've had, just seeing a lot of genetic theories and looking really closely at the evidence and really questioning whether it's valid. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
And my name's Steve Patelli. I'm a psychiatrist licensed in California. Most of my work is through forensics in the criminal justice system. I've worked in state hospitals and prisons, jails, and those sort of environments, as well as inpatient psychiatric units. And it's just always been a side interest of mine that there are a lot of claims about the genetics of mental illness. And I've always kind of taken issue with it. Over the years, I've written a lot of letters to journals, and I've just been trying to be a bit of a gadfly about it. And so hopefully we can give you a different perspective on these issues than you might normally hear. So today we're going to talk about the alleged genetics of schizophrenia. And when I was a psychiatry resident, this would have been in the mid-90s. It was presented to us that schizophrenia was highly genetic, if not fully genetic, it was even implied. And that there were a number of different reasons for this, which some of these we're going to talk about now. One was a claim that twin studies, identical twin studies and adoption studies had effectively proven a genetic link to schizophrenia with really high concordance rates, which means basically that if one of the twins, say, is schizophrenic, then another had a 50% chance of being schizophrenic. And we'll talk about some of those statistics.
Yes, definitely. This is what's taught. It's, in every textbook and every course program for students, that schizophrenia both exists, is a valid and reliably identified concept, and that there's a strong genetic component, which is usually they use the term heritability. So it's 80% heritable. That's a different aspect of that. Statistic is controversial too, but also the concept of schizophrenia has always been controversial as far as whether it's a real illness, disease that can be reliably identified, that's a valid concept. So I will be using the term schizophrenia. I will be using it in this video, but I don't necessarily recognize that it's a really valid concept. A lot of more modern thinkers are using terms like psychosis, which is more about an experience somebody goes through and lives out, as opposed to a disease that they have. So I will use the term schizophrenia, but yes, Steve, as you mentioned, twin studies and adoption studies, those are the main evidence and that are cited. The main evidence is cited, but very problematic, especially twin studies, which I'll get into a little later. And the most frequently cited adoption studies also are very problematic. I think we'll also discuss that.
And I'm kind of in agreement with you about schizophrenia. The way I view, there's a couple of issues here. One is that there are a lot of different things that kind of get thrown into the diagnosis of schizophrenia that could be very different between one person and the next. And some of that, in my view, has to do with the limitations of the DSM, which is the kind of the Bible of psychiatry in terms of making a diagnosis. And each diagnosis has a list of symptoms and whatnot. And a lot of people are given the same diagnosis, even though if you really meet these people in person, which a lot of scientists never really do, they'll all be designated as schizophrenia, if I can do a quote mark here. And there that creates some difficulty because you're eventually going to be doing genetic studies on these individuals, and with the idea that they have some similar, physical, neurological problem when they really don't right off the bat. So I have issues with the diagnosis from that perspective as well.
So the question is, what is the main evidence that's cited in support of strong genetic influence or heritability of schizophrenia? And the evidence is, first off, there's family studies, running in the families, higher rates among family members. Most genetic researchers, would now agree that that does not prove anything about genetics because, behaviors can run in the family for reasons having nothing to do with genetics. So those are used, but usually that's the first step and not cited currently, although in the past they were, as genetic evidence. So the main evidence is twin studies. So what twin studies do is they compare the concordance rate of identical monozygotic and fraternal dizygotic twins, and they compare those rates. And if identical twins are more concordant for schizophrenia, or if one has it, the other one also has it, at a significantly higher rate than fraternals, then they would conclude that this is evidence that genetics is operating. But the critical assumption of these studies is that the environments of both sets of twins are the same. And by the way, I should just mention, we're talking about twins that are reared together in the same family. So these are not separated, reared apart twins. We're talking, there are no studies of reared apart twins for schizophrenia other than individual pairs that are reported, kind of anecdotal study reports. So for reared together twins, the assumption is that identical and fraternal twins experience equal environments growing up. And the reality is that the environments are very, very different. Identical twins are treated more alike, they spend more time together, they experience identity confusion and attachment to each other to a much greater level than fraternal twins. So what critics argue is that the difference in these concordance rates can be explained by environmental factors, or at least that environment and genetic and environmental factors are so entangled that you cannot really separate them. And therefore, twin studies really do not prove anything about genetics. This is one of the big issues. Schizophrenia adoption studies, there are about 15 to 20. The first one was published in 1928. So they go back a long way. There's a long history of those studies. And they almost all of them show higher concordance for identical versus fraternal twins. But how we interpret that is really the key question. So psychiatry interprets that in favor of genetics, and critics interpret it, will say that it's uninterpretable, or that environmental factors can explain the difference. So this is a very major area of contention. The other main evidence is adoption studies, where they study children who are adopted away, or in various kind of different configurations of how they do that. The most famous are the Danish adoption studies, which are done by a team of American researchers and Danish researchers. And these are the most frequently cited studies. I have looked into these studies extensively in detail, especially in my latest book on the topic. I can just say very briefly that these studies did not prove anything about genetics of schizophrenia at all. What really happened was the researchers wanted to find genetic influences, and they basically, behind the scenes, changed groups, diagnoses, categories, until they were able to find something, expanding the definition of schizophrenia, changing group comparisons, until they were able to publish something which they claimed showed genetic influence on schizophrenia. If you look really closely at these studies, you could definitely say that they actually found no evidence. And I've kind of gone into this in detail in my writings. So that in a nutshell. There are a couple of other schizophrenia adoption studies, one done in Finland, I believe one in Sweden, and Oregon, the United States. Those all have their own set of problems too. But the Danish studies are the most frequently cited. So family, twin, and adoption studies, in every textbook you will read, every scientific publication, media report are supposed to have, completely confirm the genetic basis of schizophrenia. And I and other critics would argue that actually they do not at all, which leads us to the question of then attempts to discover genes in molecular genetic studies. So that's
Right.
another kind of ongoing thing. And I'll pass it over to Steve to kind of give a little background on that.
And before I talk about that, I'll say a couple other things about those studies. One being what you refer to as the expanded definition of schizophrenia, and the fact that these studies in the old days, when they were just loading up mental institutions and diagnosing everyone with schizophrenia, had much higher concordance rates than more recent ones in general. And the concordance in the old days that they claim was 50%, but that has dwindled down into the low 20s officially. If you did and if you look at certain studies, say some of the Scandinavian studies, which in theory are since they have better record keeping, there would be probably the best studies. You're getting down into the 10 to 15% range for concordance. So that means that if you have schizophrenia, your identical twin, only 10 or 15% of the time would be diagnosed with schizophrenia. And that brings me to another point, which is what is called family history. And as psychiatrists, we are, it's on our board exams, in fact, and if we don't take a family history, we would fail the boards. And you ask if anyone in your family has a particular mental illness. And if they say yes, that is considered high influence, that you're supposed to diagnose that person with the same thing. And so when you take that into consideration and you're already down in the 10 to 15% range, and then you say, oh, well, this guy has a twin brother that's schizophrenic, you're getting into some really low natural concordance rates. Because would you have diagnosed this guy as schizophrenic if you didn't know he had a twin brother that was also schizophrenic? So you're already down to that level. So you're getting down into small percentages. And as Jay already mentioned, there are a lot of other reasons why identical twins might present in similar ways that have nothing to do with genetics, for example. So I've been involved in this for a good 30 years, really, at least in terms of my interest in it, and started writing letters and whatnot about 20 years ago. And at the start with genetic studies, they had what they called candidate gene studies. And these involved trying to find one particular gene, or 2 or 3, that would be directly correlated to schizophrenia. And this went on for many years, these kinds of studies, and they would announce that they had found a gene for schizophrenia. It would make the papers generally, sometimes even the front page of a newspaper would have gene discovered. Then they would do another study, say, a year later, and it would be the same thing, gene discovered, but they wouldn't mention that it was a different gene than the last time they had done it. And so this kept going on and on. The basis behind some of the genes they were looking for, they were called dopamine receptor genes for the most part, was that a lot of the drugs that are used for schizophrenia, like Haldol and derivatives of that, and even some of the newer medications, involve dopamine blocking. So it also came off as plausible that they had these genes, they have a direct biological correlation, and therefore they've proven it. And if you try to question that, you were basically painted as a nutcase. I can tell you from personal experience.
Yep.
Okay. So a lot of these studies, it was found, in fact, all of the studies in the end, it was determined were not valid, that they did not actually find a gene for schizophrenia, and that it was more of a statistical aberration. And this went on for many, many years before they kind of gave up on the whole concept of finding candidate genes. And they now reject the entire concept of candidate genes. That's not just the skeptics, but also people in the field no longer feel that candidate genes are valid. So they moved on to what are called genome-wide association studies. And what these studies, the first thing that these studies are assuming is that because they couldn't find one or two genes for schizophrenia, like the magic specific gene that would cause the illness, they assumed that there would be a whole collection of genes, hundreds. Originally, maybe they would have said dozens, and that's moved up to thousands at this point. And so what they could do with the technology they had available, and is getting better all the time, is go through basically the entire genome, find all kinds of different genes where there's some variant of the gene as opposed to what you would typically find. And if you had a lot of these variants, then that would correlate higher to schizophrenia. That's kind of the principle behind it. There's no real evidence for this idea. It's called polygenic. It's simply an assumption of exclusion because they couldn't find single genes or two or three genes. They just kind of moved up to, and maybe it's 10, maybe it's 20, up to now thousands, and people are even going beyond thousands at this point.
Steve, as you said, these are correlations, these are associations, right? They're not showing that these genes cause anything. They're just found together, and it could be correlations that have no relationship to cause and effect, correct?
Exactly. And there's a classic study idea in the genetics field about chopsticks, for example, and that you can correlate chopsticks to certain genes because chopsticks are used mostly by people in Asia. So, just like when you would see with Ancestry.com or something, they're going to have certain gene variations that are going to be a little different than Europeans. And so you're making a correlation. Well, look at all the people that have these genes use chopsticks. And you don't want to say in that situation that these are the genes that make them use chopsticks. So that's kind of the premise of my debate with this field, is that most of what they're doing is akin to this chopsticks argument, that they're taking large groups of people, they're making generalizations, and then they're effectively claiming to prove these generalizations by pedantically looking at the differences in their genes, which doesn't add anything new to the argument. And they have no ability to demonstrate that any of these genes do anything related to schizophrenia or any other stated mental illness.
Yes, to add to what you're saying, Steve, yes, it's just these are associations, not any proof of cause. And schizophrenia gene discovery claims have gone back to the early 70s, literally, almost 50 years. They're claims by researchers, not just in the media, but the media basically reports what the researchers claim. So we've had 50 years of false alarm gene discovery claims for schizophrenia and other psychiatric diagnoses. So by default, by default, we should consider all gene discovery claims for schizophrenia genes to be false positive until proven otherwise. So there's a high level of proof that they need to come up with, given this track record of 50 years of false alarm gene discovery claims for genes for schizophrenia. Yes. And it's always the newest method is always claimed to be the latest and greatest. And now we have this new method. And the latest one is polygenic scores. This one, again, these are just associations, but this is the new method that, yes, all the other methods were wrong and we were off track. But now this new one finally definitively has proven, genetics of all behavior, IQ, personality, mental, psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia. And there are some polygenic score studies for schizophrenia that are, the latest claims. Any kind of thoughts on that, Steve?
Yeah, sir. That's being touted heavily by a couple of people in the field. Robert Plomin wrote a book called Blueprint a few years ago, and there's a new book coming out by Catherine Page Harden that also lauds polygenic scores and tries to make the claim that these are proof of something. Basically, polygenic scores, they take all of these genetic variants, you could be talking about 1,000, say, and effectively weighs them in a certain way and then adds them all up and then you get a score. And if your score is high, that means you have a higher risk of having schizophrenia, is the idea behind it. So this is a part of that polygenic model. When they've attempted to use the polygenic score to make those predictions, they've had almost no success at all. In fact, in one study, they had a 0.5% prediction success, which if you just told me that the person was male, that had a 1% prediction. So it's half as good as being told that you're male to make that prediction. If you had ever gone to the doctor with say a stomach ache or other ache or pain, that's a 4-time better prediction of schizophrenia than the polygenic score prediction in that study. And another study came out recently with the same point, that there's basically no predictability using that method. So I think their cry is always, well, we'll just get more people next time and we'll have a better prediction. But that has not borne out at this point. If anything, it's worse. And it's at least at this point useless. And other than the hopes of those doing the studies, there's no evidence that it's going to get significantly better.
I would just like to add the point that prediction, for people kind of out there, they hear that term prediction a lot. Prediction means correlation. It doesn't mean that something, causes it, right? So, for example, having a Y chromosome predicted much better that you would be attending Harvard 50 years ago, but that doesn't mean it caused it. So prediction means correlation, and correlation does not mean cause. So prediction is used a lot. It doesn't have anything to do with what causes it. It's just they're found together, they're correlated. And whether there's any causal relationship, that's another question.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's kind of a very pedantic way of stereotyping people to use these genetic correlations instead of just saying, Asian people are more likely to use chopsticks. You say people with this gene are more likely to use chopsticks. You haven't said anything new. And you can even predict correctly and have some success with a prediction like that, but it doesn't have anything to do with the actual genes. And despite that, that's kind of the impression that they're trying to give. And one other thing I wanted to discuss with these kinds of books that I just mentioned, Hardin's book and Plomin's book are good examples of this. Is when you're talking about schizophrenia, you're talking about a very dynamic subject. You're talking about people hearing voices, experiencing delusions that are very fixed, that no amount of logic can stop. You're talking about the state of psychosis. And what is the state of psychosis? I mean, I think it's an important question. Well, these are almost philosophical questions. They're very deep. They should lead to a lot of discussion about the nature of the human mind and how is a schizophrenic person, someone diagnosed with schizophrenia, different than a so-called normal person. I mean, what is normal behavior? What is psychosis? So these kinds of things, they don't appear in books like this. What appears is simply a statistical argument that schizophrenia, say, or other diagnoses are partly genetic, and it doesn't really go beyond that. And it's a banal way of looking at the human mind, and it's very unfortunate that all of our resources are being poured into this kind of overly pedantic view of the human mind. And I question whether a lot of the people involved in the field really have very much understanding of the diagnoses that they are claiming to find genes for.
I could add that a lot of authoritative leaders of psychiatry and famous authors get really basic facts wrong. And for people who really know the facts about the twin adoption studies, molecular genetics, kind of sometimes stunningly get the basic facts wrong, and obviously haven't read the original studies and don't really know much, even just a basic idea of what the basic studies that were done, and sometimes shockingly get facts wrong. I've written about and documented, for one example, Pulitzer Prize winner Siddhartha Mukherjee's book, The Gene and Intimate History. His description of schizophrenia genetic research really shows a real lacking of understanding of just the basic points. He said that the fleets of twin studies were published in the 1980s. There were no fleets of twin studies published in the 1980s. So a lot of authoritative figures really get basic facts wrong, including past presidents of the American Psychiatric Association. I've documented all this. So a lot of authoritative leaders have not necessarily even read or really critically examined the original family, twin, and adoption studies, or read the works of critics. They'll get their information from secondary sources, and also a lot of times get basic facts wrong. So people should understand that just because an authoritative leader says the genetics of schizophrenia is an established fact doesn't mean that they've really looked into this issue very carefully, necessarily.
Yeah, and that, that speaks to kind of the zeitgeist that has been created around genetics and this idea, and it's been propagated by experts, and then by the media as well, the experts kind of push their studies, and then it gets amplified, and then the general public buys into it, and so there's kind of a mythos that has been created of these genes that are causing schizophrenia, or improving someone's IQ, or making them like a certain kind of ice cream flavor, and it just keeps propagating. And I think that even experts are subject to this problem.
Yes, and the assumptions of twin studies are rarely really mentioned or investigated or really looked at in a lot of the authoritative textbooks, and especially media reports and other reports, that twin studies are really the basis for all of these claims in psychiatry, that there's a genetic underpinning, heritability, all of these things, but rarely is it really looked very seriously at the underlying assumptions. The main one, the equal environment assumption, identical fraternal twins, is so obviously false, but yet it's rarely even looked at, and can lead to some absurd conclusions. So a study came out about a year ago showing, according to a twin study, dog ownership is 55% heritable. So if you believe in the logic of twin studies, then you would have to say that dog ownership is almost as heritable as schizophrenia, or more than IQ even. According to twin research, the alternative explanation is twin research is seriously flawed and needs to be really looked at very seriously by an objective panel, and looking at all of the arguments of critics and supporters alike, and coming up with an objective evaluation, which is not done in psychiatry. Psychiatry does not has many task force. They've never had one looking at the validity of schizophrenia, the validity of twin studies, the Danish adoption studies. That would be an excellent task force for the American Psychiatric Association.
And I'll say also that genetic studies they have equally ridiculous things, like ice cream flavor that I already mentioned. That there was an actual genetic study. Church attendance, going to the gym, being a gym rat. I mean, the list goes on of things that they've claimed to find genetic correlations for. Which,
loneliness, a gene for loneliness, they claim to have found.
Loneliness. So it doesn't seem to dissuade. They'll often dismiss these, but they're done in the same way that their other studies are done, that they consider more credible, and they're not making any distinction other than their personal feel that it's something different, and that those can be dismissed, and the ones they agree with don't need to be dismissed.
Okay, so to wrap up, what we've tried to do today is to give you, to listeners and viewers, just a different idea, a very different perspective on the genetics of schizophrenia than you've probably heard everywhere else in your entire life, the media, textbooks, classes, TV, all of these places, that we're giving you another point of view, that there really isn't much evidence that there's a biological disorder, schizophrenia, and whatever that is, that there's really not much scientifically acceptable evidence that it has a genetic basis. Twin studies are very flawed because they're based on a false assumption in addition to other problems. And the adoption studies are extremely methodologically flawed. I've written before that, especially the Danish adoption studies are really more an example of what should be considered a scandal in psychiatry and in science than evidence in favor of genetics, and those should be looked at very closely. And the works of critics also. So there really is not much, if any, little if any evidence that there's a schizophrenia and that it has a genetic basis. And I know this is shocking, for people to hear, but this is an opinion that has to. The reason the molecular genetic researchers have not discovered genes that cause schizophrenia is because most likely those genes do not exist. So if there are no genes to be found, then of course researchers will not find genes because they don't exist. So new methods will be developed, grants will be funded, they can keep looking, but the evidence really suggests there's no evidence that those genes really even exist. And I think that's a really important point that people should understand. And so I would predict, I've been predicting since at least 1999 that no genes for schizophrenia will be found because they don't exist. And up to now, as we're shooting this video, there's no evidence they found any genes or that any genes for schizophrenia exist.
And if you made that argument in 1999, you were not given a lot of respect. And that's part of the issue here is now we've watched it in real time for decades, still nothing is found. And at some point, they need to give it up.
Yeah.
So until next time, thanks for listening. And that's it.